Okay, yeah, so this is going to back up a little bit to some of the larger framing pieces for the design and be an update on where the scenario process, SSP RCP scenario process stands at the moment. I will, 15 minutes is a tall order, but I'm really going to try very hard. Okay, just one quick reminder of, what is this scenario process actually mean? I think we're all on the same page about this, but just to make sure, when we say the new scenario process or parallel process or so on, this is what it means. It means the process that was started, I think it's maybe 7 or 8 years ago now, when the RCPs, these representative concentration pathways, were defined. These are concentration or forcing pathways over time. And the idea was to do two things in parallel. On the one hand, on the right-hand side, run those in the climate models and simulate climate futures. That's the CMIP-5 activity, which is complete. At the same time, on the left-hand side, develop a new set of socioeconomic futures, the SSPs, or shared socioeconomic pathways, and then bring them together in the end to do integrated analyses of various kinds, impact studies, mitigation, and so on. There's a little bit of an in-between step here. There's IAM scenarios that are under development right now that are not quite integrated. They're not using climate change information yet. There's sort of no climate scenarios. What I'm going to talk about today is these two things, the SSPs and these IAM scenarios. AgMIP would go in here, right? One of the integrated analyses. There is another piece to this that's been mentioned, CMIP-6, the next round of climate simulation. So where does that fit in? The scenario process was about CMIP-5, not CMIP-6. But to do the climate model simulations, like anything, you need years in advance to plan them, carry them out, and then have them be available. So that planning has already taken place. But the way to think of it in this process is that, well, we get a little bit of experience with what kind of scenarios are turning out to be useful, and then we use that to say, what do we need to do for the next round of climate simulations, thinking ahead to 2020 when they would be available. That design has already occurred. The idea is to run an updated set of RCPs plus some additional pathways. The idea then is that over the next 4 or 5 years, climate models would be run again, so you'd have CMIP-5 and CMIP-6, and then you would do even more integrated studies. As discussed yesterday, CMIP-6 is not really, I don't think, going to be directly relevant to this AgMIP activity, so I'm not going to talk about that anymore. If questions come up, we can go through what is the design and so on. But the CMIP-5 stuff is, I think, enough to handle at the moment. Okay, so SSPs, a reminder of what these are. These are development pathways that include two kinds of information, qualitative narratives and quantitative elements for particular drivers, we can think of them as. And there are 5 of them, and they were designed with this conceptual framework, right? Because there's millions of possible future development pathways. We want a small number. How do you decide which ones? And the idea was explicitly, these are for climate research, and what we want them to do is to underpin studies that can explore a range of uncertainty in terms of how hard or easy it might be to adapt given future socioeconomic conditions, not climate. Just what are the socioeconomic conditions that make it hard or easy to adapt, or hard or easy to mitigate. So we might end up in a pathway where it's not too bad to do either of those. That's the optimistic development. Tough to do both, or tough to do one but not the other, or kind of medium on all of them. That was the idea. So those were developed with that in mind. 5 pathways where the hypothesis was these are stories about the future that would produce those kinds of outcomes. with national level quantitative projections for population, education, urbanization, GDP. Under development, there are subnational projections right now for spatial population distribution and income distributions. So where these, let me skip this for now. Where these stand at the moment is that this conceptual framework was published a couple years ago. The narratives and all of the quantitative projections for the SSPs are published. All of the projections are available online on an IASA database. This is just a plot of some of them and the institutions that produced the different projections. But these are available, very easy to download and look at on the website. It's a great website that IASA produced. So that's the SSPs. If you're interested in kind of following this process and for seeing a list of these publications, where are they, and a database of, to date, all the publications we know about that have used the SSPs for something, there's a website. It's hosted at NCAR, but it's this organization called Iconics, which is a kind of international group of people who are just trying to help facilitate the process of producing and using the SSPs. There's also a mailing list that you can sign up for that gets used for discussing these things. Okay, one final note on the SSP status is that the SSPs are not scenarios. Now that's semantics to some degree, right? What one person wants to call a scenario or another is going to differ, and that's fine. But in the SSP world, these are called pathways, not scenarios. And there's a specific reason for that, which is important for understanding what are they and how do you use them, is that the goal here is not the SSP. The goal is to use the SSP. It's a methodological step on the way to what you really want to do, which is a scenario that includes climate effects, climate impacts, policies, right? These are the things that people really want to study. What will be the climate impact on agriculture? What are the adaptation options? How difficult would it be to mitigate down to RCP 4.5? You don't get that from an SSP. The SSP is development only, doesn't have emissions or land use or energy use in it. It has no policy in it, and it has no climate impacts. And that's by design, because you want to use these as a starting point, one building block, to do many, 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 many scenario analyses of all different kinds. So if you put this stuff in an SSP, you can't do the analysis. If an SSP developer hands you a scenario that says, here's an SSP with climate impacts on agriculture, go do your agricultural assessment, you say, well, it's already in there, so what do I do with that? So the SSPs are a step along the way. And so semantically, that's the distinction that we try to make between a pathway and a scenario, right? So you have SSPs, which are one input to scenarios of different kinds. The scenarios may also have policies in them or not. Those scenarios may or may not have climate impacts. They can be of different kinds. Okay. Just as a point of information and something that can be looked into more and maybe helping think about AgMIP connections between global and regional studies, scenarios, or pathways, whatever they may be. There are a number of activities that have either already done something like that or in which such an kind of goal is underway. There's an Arctic assessment underway that is using the SSPs to develop Arctic scenarios. There are European projects that are developing SSP-based European outcomes for the future. There's been some use of the SSPs for a Southeast study. The CCAF studies in particular regions that have used the SSPs. As I understand it, and maybe Cynthia knows more about this, I talked to Chris Ebi, and there's maybe thought of having a Provia-sponsored regional workshop on developing more detailed regional versions of the SSPs coming up. And the way the SSPs get used, a lot of different approaches. Typically what is not done, doesn't seem to work very well, is the straight top-down, here's the SSP, hand it to you, you then devise something that logically follows at the regional level, starting with a global SSP. More often it's been people develop their own scenarios, and then afterwards they look and say, does this regional scenario look anything like one of these SSPs? Can I map to it afterwards? But there's lots of different approaches. Okay, so I wanted to show you just a quick look at what some of the IAM scenario results look like for scenarios based on the SSPs. And as I mentioned in the original diagram, these are IAM scenarios that don't yet include climate impacts. So they are producing energy, ag, land use emissions, and so on as no climate impact scenarios. They do have, some of them are without mitigation policy, some of them are with mitigating down to be consistent with the different RCPs in AgMIP 5 so that they can be used together, right? And again, the idea is you don't want impacts in here yet. If they do the impacts, you can't do the impacts, they're already done. So as a service to the climate impacts community, you provide scenarios that may be useful in helping other people then do impact assessment. So these are all preliminary. They're also all available on the SSP database, expected to be finalized later this year. So just to give a sense of, there's lots of them. This is just CO2 emissions. This is all of the SSPs for their no mitigation outcomes. If you don't put any mitigation on them, what kind of CO2 emissions do you end up with? And then in all SSPs, each one mitigated down to each of the RCP levels, to 6.0, 4.5, 2.6 watts per meter squared. I've only labeled on here the highest emitting futures. They are the reference scenarios. That means unmitigated, no mitigation scenarios. SSP 5 produces the largest ones. What I didn't label on here, there's 5 models doing all of this. The ASA model, PIC, IMAGE, the GCAM group here in the US, and the AIM model from Japan. So they're all in there somewhere. Each SSP, one model has been identified to just serve as the marker or kind of the illustrative outcome. But in principle, there's about 5 times more scenarios because all the models have done most of the scenarios. So SSP 5 reference scenario, that is a PIC result, the Remind Magpie result. But several other models have done that exact scenario as well. Okay, so there's lots of them, and just to emphasize, as I said, here I'm just singling out, this is just the SSP 5 scenarios, right? So you get a scenario that's unmitigated, and then you get the same SSP with mitigation policy applied to reach each of the successively lower radiative forcing outcomes consistent with AgMIP 5. Okay, forcing, total forcing from all greenhouse gases and aerosols. This is just the reference scenarios, unmitigated scenarios. They range from 5 to a little above 8.5, around 9 watts per meter squared. 5 is the highest, 1 is the lowest. Now this has implications for the scenario matrix diagram, which you may have seen, because you see that lots of scenarios don't reach RCP 8.5. Not all of them even may not quite reach 6.0. So if we translate this into our picture of the matrix, I've removed some of the cells on here. Some of the combinations of SSPs and RCPs, if all of the cells were in here, those cells represent potential scenarios that possibly you could combine an SSP with an RCP. But as it turns out, some of them are not feasible. In SSP 1, this is the range over the different models of forcing that you get in SSP 1. There's just not enough energy use and emissions and so on to produce that much climate. So most of the 8.5 row is not feasible. Only SSP 5 reaches it. It turns out that SSP 3, for various reasons, is very tough and impossible in the current models to get down to 2.6, so that one's not there either. So this is actually the matrix of possibilities to choose from for whatever design you're looking at. Okay, just a couple more results that may be of interest. Bioenergy came up yesterday. Here's bioenergy projections in all the reference scenarios, so right, not a lot in the baselines. If you add mitigation in a couple of the SSPs, you get lots of bioenergy use. And it turns out it's in SSP 4 and 5. As a consequence, if you're looking at things like cropland, total global cropland, you get a spread in the reference scenarios. The highest use, because these include biomass crops, are in the mitigation scenarios for SSP 4 and 5. So when we're thinking about, like, well, AgMIP design experiments that might be useful to have a lot of bioenergy in them, you'd want to look at the SSPs and say, well, which scenarios are looking like that? Okay, so I will leave. This is the last thing I want to mention, which is that there has been, and this is separate work already published without climate impacts, but the AIM group in Japan has done an analysis with all of the SSPs of the implications for risk of hunger. This is no climate impacts, right? But this is just to emphasize that the SSPs have an enormous influence in this analysis on projected risk of hunger. In 3 of them, there isn't any by the middle of the century. In 2 of them, it remains substantial. So looking at agricultural futures and food security, the SSP is decisive. So I will stop with just saying for the design, in thinking about this, we'd want to make sure that the scenarios that are chosen for the AgMIP design follow clearly from the questions that are being asked, and that they draw on the SSP narratives and the IAM results that have been generated so far. And I think going forward, if there's more ways that this group can interact with the IAM modelers and the SSP community, that's going to improve prospects. Thanks.
We take a couple of questions for mainly clarification, I would say.
Okay.
Because we can't really have a longer discussion right now.
Yeah. I just would like to know if you could elaborate a little bit on this SSP 5 RCP 8.5 issue, because RCP 8.5 has been the one that most people have been focusing on.
Yeah.
I would like to understand why this is so unlikely in the setting. Are the SSPs not that representative as the original choice of IAM settings that produce the RCPs? Or what is the issue why this is now so unlikely?
That RCP 8.5 is unlikely?
Yeah.
Well, for one, I don't think this should be immediately equated with likelihood, right? So this was not the experimental design, as I said, was develop SSPs that span a range of adaptive capacity and mitigation capacity, not a likelihood distribution for future emissions. If you did that, you would probably get a different distribution. However, in talking to the IAM groups, it does seem to be the feeling that it is tough to get a large enough economy locked in on fossil fuels enough to generate emissions that are as high, to get you up to 8.5 watts per meter squared. So I think, although there has been no study that said, let's see how high we can get emissions to go and how hard is that. There haven't been studies like that. Informally, it is my sense that it does get difficult to get emissions that high. One of the problems that it creates, and I do think this is a real problem for this framework, is that there is only one development pathway to use. And SSP 5 is a very optimistic human development pathway. People are rich, very well educated, healthy, high quality local environmental quality. The only thing that doesn't turn out well is that in this hypothetical counterfactual here, you lock into fossil fuels and don't worry about it, unless you mitigate. So we only have an optimistic high climate future. This is the pessimistic development future, and it doesn't quite reach 8.5. And that is an option. So in a study that we're doing at NCAR, a bunch of different impact studies, a bunch of papers, we wanted explicitly to have a high climate future with an optimistic and a pessimistic development pathway. So we developed a variant of SSP3 that just boosts GDP growth, just scales things up, doesn't really change the nature or composition, enough to be consistent with 8.5. And I would say that is something to keep in mind here. It's not a big deal. You don't have to change GDP a lot. And it is something that if that were an interesting comparison within AgMIP as well, I think it's totally feasible to do.
Other things unclear, just from the understanding?
Just,
Otherwise, we
Brian,
move on.
You mentioned the issue of CMIP 5, CMIP 6. That topic seems to be really going in a different direction. At some point, it might be worthwhile to have a conversation. The general thinking within that community is that not to make the distinction between 3, 5, 6, and have all these experiments and runs available, because there is no reason to believe that the quality of models for certain experimental designs were significantly different from CMIP 3 to CMIP 5 and presumably CMIP 6. Are you aware of that discussion within the CMIP community? And
Of being able to use, when CMIP 6 is available, the CMIP 5 runs as well?
I mean, what they're advocating is that to use all experiments from CMIP 3 all the way to CMIP 6 in the ensembles.
Could we perhaps take this to the break?
Sure.
Unless I think is that okay?
Yeah.
Just
I mean,
a-
the
yeah.
AgMIP community
flag.
needs to be aware that
Yeah,
that
it's
conversation is
good to
going
flag it.
on.
Yeah.
Good to know about it, and perhaps it's a longer discussion. Thank you, Brian.
My phone.